You are about to step with me into the narrow, wet, and silent world beneath our feet. Tonight we will follow 3 true cave stories that begin like ordinary adventures and end with moments that test human endurance and courage. Before we move deeper, subscribe to Cave Explained so you do not miss more real stories of caving, rescue, and the lessons they leave behind. The first story begins on an icy morning when a group of friends set out to explore a new crack in the earth. They were prepared as far as friends can be: headlamps, ropes, and curiosity. One of them had found the tiny slot while walking the ridge. It looked harmless from above, a narrow seam in the rocks, barely wider than a dinner plate. They tied a rope across the lip and one by one, the men inspected the hole. Only one could fit. He was the smallest of the group, older than the others but fit, and he volunteered to go first so the group could see what lay below. He squeezed into the slot, twisting his shoulders, feeling damp stone graze his clothes. Gravity helped him ease downward at first. The rope became a handline and then a lifeline as he dropped into a darker room that opened beneath the tight throat. For a moment he could breathe, stretch his arms, and look down a second drop that disappeared into shadow. He shone his headlamp and the beam painted twisting passages like the convolutions of a shell. Alone in that small pool of light, he made a sensible choice: explore only a little and return. Climbing back proved to be everything the descent had not been. What had seemed a simple squeeze down turned into a trap on the way up. The slot that had welcomed him now held him like a vice. His wet clothing stuck to the stone. Every pull on the rope pulled the stone closer. The relaxed posture that helped him enter was gone. Tight, damp rock pressed against his chest and shoulders. Panic rose and fell with each breath. Outside, his friends strained on the rope, pulling and shouting, while the cold worked on him from the inside out. The passage was so tight he could hardly reach his ascender, and his hands, chilled and trembling, began to fail him. When the group realized he could not free himself, they made the hard decision to go for help. A short hike back to a house and a frantic phone call brought a cave rescue team that knew exactly what to do with narrow entrances and the kind of rigging that could free a man stuck between rock and gravity. They arrived with extra clothing and with the calm practiced only by those who have worked in the dark before. They fed him warm broth through a narrow slot and wrapped insulating layers around his shoulders. Then they set up hauling systems, levers, in a patient rhythm of tug and rest as they worked the man inch by cold inch back into the light. When he finally came free, bruised and shivering, he could stand and walk. The lesson there is subtle and terrifying. The same narrow throat that allows you to enter easily can prevent you from going out. In tight caves, the difference between entry and exit is not only a function of skill but of physics, wet clothing, and timing. Our second story takes place in a subtler cave, one that sits cool and quiet in a forested part of Florida. A group of young explorers entered on a winter afternoon. 2 counselors waited outside while the boys crawled into the maze. They thought the cave was safe for teenagers. The temperature inside was comfortable compared to the crisp air outdoors, and the rock did not look treacherous from the small opening. The boys moved in a line, elbows and knees finding their way through low ceilings and sharp turns, until they came to a bend so tight it turned like a hairpin. No one knew what lay beyond. At that hairpin curve one of the boys became wedged. He could not move forward, and he could not retreat. One friend crawled back to help and, in the process of trying to free him, became exhausted and slipped into unconsciousness from the cold and the strain. Their companions waited in a pocket of wider passage, anxious, but unable to force the narrow curve open. Panic, always a cruel agent in caves, began to infect the group. Some imagined the worst. They worried about oxygen, about the air being used up, though the reality in that cave was different. They reached a brutal decision that haunts many rescue stories: they would leave and get help. Outside, the counselors extinguished a small campfire that had been burning near the opening so rescuers would not be misled by smoke and to prevent any risk of the fire changing conditions near the entrance. The call to emergency services brought trained cave rescuers and dedicated volunteers. The team arrived with chisels, harnesses, and the patient determination needed to widen a space that refuses to give. They worked methodically, chipping and levering to expand the hairpin while protecting the boys from shock and further temperature loss. The friend who had lost consciousness was pulled free first and wrapped in blankets. The boy who had been stuck was released after careful widening of the passage. Both were hypothermic, one of them lay pale and drifting in and out of awareness. They were cared for and carried out on litters, then transferred to the waiting ambulances. This rescue shows how quickly a routine exploration can become a medical emergency when bodies are pressed against cold rock and time is not on your side. Cold does not feel immediate. It steals strength slowly. It blunts rational thought and makes simple movements impossible. In caves where passages are tight, the risk is not only the squeeze, it is the long exposure to damp rock and the inability to shift and warm up. Groups, especially with young people, need to plan for the worst even when everything seems fine. The third story brings us to a vertical cave with a dramatic entrance, a pit that drops straight and far into rushing water. Two friends arrived in conditions that looked ordinary and turned quickly dangerous. Rain above made the pit wet. Water did not merely drip, it became a cascade down the entrance, and the rope had to be rigged through that wet curtain of falling water. They had wetsuits in their car but left them behind. One of them was missing a helmet. At the top, the noise of the waterfall hid the subtle clicks and failures that would later become essential clues to what went wrong. They descended. The water struck them with cold force. It stole the heat from them faster than they could generate it. When one of the men felt that his gear was not holding, he tried to climb but found the rope slick and his gloves numb. Answers that require dexterity became unreachable when fingers fail. The other man attempted a self-rescue that in theory could have worked, but the torrent of the pit and the numbing cold made movement terrible. At some point one of them could not continue. The other tried to haul him, to attach his rope to his own harness, to find a ledge, anything to find shelter. Exhaustion and cold crept up. Hands that once gripped now slipped. Decision-making faltered. In the end one of them was found still hanging in the waterfall, while the other, weakened and spent, managed to cut himself free and force an escape to the surface. This is the most brutal teaching of all. Wet vertical caves with pouring water require specific gear, training, and respect. Wetsuits and helmets are not optional in those places. A single failure of a clip, a misapplied knot, or wet gloves can be the difference between an awkward problem and a tragic end. The body is a delicate machine in cold, and when water robs it of heat, the machine fails in predictable ways. Across these three stories, a pattern emerges. Caving is not a test of bravery so much as a test of humility. Attention to small details, respect for weather, and conservative decision-making matter. Hypothermia is the quiet threat in all of them. It begins as shivering and grows into exhaustion and confusion. Hands fumble, speech slurs, coordination fails. That progression is important to understand because the brain responds by making poor choices precisely when good judgment is needed most. When someone is cold and wet, their natural instincts may lead them to do the very thing that risks them further. Rescue teams in these stories are the other half of the lesson. They are patient, methodical, and calm. They bring insulation, they rig hauling systems and belays, and they have learned to change the pace of a rescue by inserting rest into the operation. A rescue is not just brute force. It is careful planning, repeated checks, and a willingness to slow down when haste would cause harm. Rescuers often speak of the value of small comforts, a warm drink, a dry layer, a word that reassures a trapped person that they are not alone. Those small acts buy time, and time is everything in a cold, tight space. Beyond the technicalities are human stories. Think of the friend who stayed behind and tried to free another and nearly lost everything in the attempt. Think of the older man who entered a hole because he could fit and later had to be dug out like someone pulled from a keyhole. Think of the young boys who learned in a single afternoon how fragile heat and youth can be against the indifference of stone. In each case there's regret and gratitude, blame and relief. People walk away with scars that are not always visible. They carry new habits and new cautions. If you plan to cover real caves or take younger explorers into narrow places, there are practical rules that emerge from these stories. Read the cave first from the maps and from people who have been there. Dress for the cave, not for the car ride. Protect your extremities and never underestimate how quickly wet clothing will cool you. Make sure at least one person in the group is carrying equipment suited for a worst case. Tell someone on the surface where you are and when you will be out. If you are guiding inexperienced people, consider not letting them enter passages that you cannot safely supervise. Finally, cultivate the ability to say no to temptation. The narrow hole that begs to be explored may be hiding a cost you cannot imagine until you are already inside. There's also a deeper lesson about modern rescue culture. Because we have trained teams that will come and help, some groups push boundaries they should not push. Rescue teams are heroic, but they are not there to make reckless choices safe. They are a safety net in a community, not a license to ignore prudence. Respect the rescuers by planning so their risks are minimized. As you listen to these stories, try to imagine the small sensations that turn into crisis: the cloth of a wet shirt clinging to the skin, the cold that makes fingers spike pain with every pull on a rope, the echo of shouted names that get lost in the rock, and the sudden, terrible awareness that you cannot move. Those are the moments that alter lives. Now, I want to ask you something. When you think about these stories, which image stays with you the longest? Is it the narrow slot that traps a man, the hairpin curve that takes the breath from a teenager, or the waterfall pulling heat from a pair of friends? Why does that image affect you? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us whether you would change anything about how those trips were planned. If you are a caver, if you are planning a trip for others, or if you love these kinds of true accounts, tell us one safety practice you always use and one rule you wish everyone followed. Your answers could help someone else stay safe. Before you leave, please subscribe to Cave Explain if you want more accounts like these, told with care and respect. Like the video if you found value in these stories, and leave a comment with your reaction. If you would like a deep dive into one of these incidents, how rescue teams actually rig their systems, how hypothermia changes the human body step by step, or a technical breakdown of vertical wet pit techniques, say which one in the comments and I will bring you a focused episode. Thank you for listening. Walking out of a cave is always a small triumph. Telling these stories is a way to honor those who were tested and to pass along what we learned. Stay curious, stay careful, and until next time, explore with respect.